My girlfriend rejected my marriage proposal and accused me of hiding her grandfather's death. I remember the moment I realized just how fragile life could be. It was late afternoon, and the sun was spilling through the western windows of my parents' old farmhouse, where I grew up chasing chickens across the yard and learning to climb the ancient oak tree out back. The air smelled of dust motes and chamomile tea, and my mother, thinner than she used to be, frailer too, sat me down at the kitchen table and quietly slid a small velvet box across the scarred wooden surface. Her hair was neatly combed, even though she'd begun to lose some of it due to her treatments. And there was a certain serenity in her eyes that unsettled me as much as it comforted. She didn't look scared. Rather, she looked focused, like someone who understands precisely how fleeting time can be. Inside the box was the engagement ring that had once belonged to my great-grandmother. A slim band of gold, set with a modest but beautifully cut diamond. The setting was old-fashioned, the kind you might see in sepia-toned photographs. But it glinted with an undeniable light, a subtle promise of durability through generations. My mother looked at me and said, "You'll know what to do with this." Her tone was gentle, yet there was something resolute in it. I couldn't stop staring at the ring. It felt heavy in my hands, not because of its physical weight, but because of what it represented. The merging of past and future, the bridging of love across time. In that instant, I knew I wanted my girlfriend, let's call her Emily, to have it. I'd been dating Emily for 3 years. Everyone who knew me or saw us together assumed that someday we'd get married, but I'd never felt any rush. We were happy, we were young, we were still discovering who we were and what life might hold. But the moment my mother passed me that ring, something inside me shifted. I realized that if I was so sure I wanted to spend my life with Emily, why not do it now? Why wait? My mother's condition, advanced cancer, kept reminding me of the brevity of our time. I think deep down, I was terrified that my mother might never see the engagement. I wanted her to witness that step in my life. I wanted to cling to something hopeful. I didn't waste a second. I thanked my mother, slid the box into my jacket, and drove straight to Emily's place. She lived in a small apartment complex not too far from the old college campus where we'd first met, an unassuming building with peeling paint on the balcony railings and a line of hedges that had grown wild over the summer. By the time I parked my car and climbed the steps, my heart was thrumming in my chest as though it might leap right out. Emily answered the door in sweatpants, looking relaxed, her hair tied up. The surprise on her face when I dropped to one knee and opened the box was almost comical at first. Her eyebrows shot up, and she pressed her hands to her mouth. For a second, she just stared at me, and I remember blurting something like, "I love you. I want you to wear this. Marry me." It might not have been the grand, carefully orchestrated proposal some people dream about. There were no rose petals or champagne flutes, but it was raw, honest, and entirely from the heart. Yet, as I gazed into her eyes, I realized she wasn't beaming with joy. She was trembling, blinking back tears. At first, I thought it was joy, but the confusion in her expression told a different story. Her voice wavered as she asked, "Are you serious?" She led me into her living room, gently closed the door behind us, and sat down on the couch. I felt like my entire body was buzzing with adrenaline. I took her hands in mine. That ring box sat on the coffee table, still open. I tried to pour out my heart, about how I'd known since our 4th date that she was the one, about how certain I felt now that my mother gave me the ring. I told her it wasn't about pity or about rushing. It was about clarity and the deep certainty that we were right for each other. But as I spoke, her eyes were wide and filled with concern. Her breath came in shallow bursts, and before I knew it, she started listing reasons why she couldn't say yes. First, she pointed out that we'd never really faced adversity together. We were still in a kind of perpetual honeymoon phase, just having fun, laughing at silly jokes, enjoying dates and road trips, never discussing heavier issues. She said, "We've never had a real disagreement that tested us. We don't know how we handle conflict or how we'd weather tragedy as a couple." I tried to argue that our good times were evidence enough that we'd handle bad times well. She wasn't convinced. She had a point. Second, she mentioned we'd never truly lived together. Sure, we spent weekends at each other's places or went on vacations, but it wasn't the same as sharing bills, chores, day-to-day stresses, and a home address. But the most painful points she raised were about the emotional distance between us. She reminded me that we rarely confided our deepest worries or pain in each other. I'd hidden my mother's cancer diagnosis from her for months. She too had leaned on her friends, not me, after her grandfather passed away. We were each other's escapes from pain, rather than partners sharing that pain. I felt a jolt when she said that. I realized it was true. We had a comfortable relationship, but maybe it was too comfortable. It was a bubble of lightness, a respite from the world. Did that mean we hadn't built a deeper foundation? She also brought up how we never talked about our future plans in any real detail. Didn't I want to know her goals, her dreams, whether she wanted children someday or if she might move to a different state? I insisted that any dream I had was less important than being with her, but she asked me, how can you build a real life with someone if you don't even know each other's direction? I tried to tell her we could figure it out once we were married. She shook her head. Marriage changes things, she said. You can't just assume it'll be like a permanent version of what we have now. Life hits you with responsibilities, unexpected stresses, big decisions. Are we ready for that? Then came the hardest thing to hear. Are you doing this because you're afraid to lose your mother? She asked, her voice quiet and sympathetic, or because you think this will give her peace, seeing you engaged? I felt angry at first, but only because it hurt to think she doubted the purity of my proposal. But something in my gut told me it was worth examining. My mother's condition had accelerated all of my emotions. Fear can masquerade as certainty. It's possible I was trying to create a joyous milestone to cling to in the face of something terrifying. By the end of that conversation, Emily made it clear she loved me but couldn't say yes. Not yet. She suggested we work on our emotional intimacy, communication, and maybe consider living together. She wanted to see if we could truly build a partnership. I felt heartbroken. I'd expected an excited yes, tears of happiness, not tears of hesitation. Part of me wanted to scream, either you love me or you don't, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I drove back to my tiny studio apartment, tears prickling behind my eyes, ringbox perched in the passenger seat. I scrolled aimlessly through my phone, searching for some sort of validation or empathy. That's how I ended up writing a post on Reddit, explaining the situation in bare bones, how my girlfriend had turned down my proposal after 3 years together, how she said we weren't ready. I expected a flood of, you dodged a bullet, or, she doesn't really love you. Instead, I got a range of perspectives, some supportive, some gently chiding, many praising Emily for her caution. Several pointed out how naive I sounded. They asked if we'd ever truly discussed big topics, if I even had a career plan, if we'd faced any genuine hardship together. One comment that stuck in my mind was, slow down, what's the rush? Enjoy the scenery, build a deeper connection. I felt defensive at first, but as the days passed I realized there was truth in those words. Our entire relationship had been built around laughter and adventure, skipping over the more serious aspects of life. Was it surprising that Emily balked when I suddenly tried to push us to the next level, especially under the cloud of my mother's illness? During this introspection, I watched my mother's health fluctuate. Some days she'd be too weak to even leave her bed. Other days she managed to walk around the yard and comment on how the leaves had turned from green to gold in the autumn sun. My father, a typically stoic man, started calling me every evening to see how I was doing. He rarely mentioned his own feelings. My sister, who lived a couple of hours away, texted me updates about mom's chemo treatments, asking me to come by when I could. I realized that if I was going to be a supportive partner to Emily someday, I needed to learn how to be a supportive son first. I began visiting more often, talking frankly with mom about her prognosis and how she was handling everything. She'd share stories of her childhood on that farm, her memories of her grandmother, the original owner of the ring, and how that woman had faced tough times with unwavering grace. It comforted me somehow to link the ring to those who had persevered before me. One night, I admitted to my mother how my proposal went. She was lying on the couch, wrapped in a colorful quilt, the TV on mute. I told her Emily hadn't exactly said no, but she hadn't said yes either. My voice caught in my throat as I tried to express the confusion I felt. She smiled softly, patted my hand and said, sometimes life doesn't unfold the way we script it. That doesn't mean it won't unfold the way it's meant to. She told me not to rush on her account, that her time, however limited, was still hers to cherish. Her acceptance helped ease my worry. She wasn't demanding to see me engaged, she just wanted me to be happy. Meanwhile, Emily and I started having deeper talks. We'd call each other at night and speak honestly. She'd ask how my mom was doing and I'd fill her in, acknowledging that it was painful to talk about. She'd offer her condolences, and I'd accept her support instead of brushing it aside. We discussed how we wanted to handle emotional challenges in the future, how to be there for each other in a more significant way. It was awkward at first, like we were learning a new language, but slowly, I felt a shift in the closeness we shared. Less pretending, more raw honesty. A week later, Emily asked me to come over for dinner, saying she had a proposal of her own. My heart pounded nervously as I drove to her apartment. I kept wondering, was she about to reverse her decision and say yes? Or was she about to break up with me? When I arrived, she'd cooked a simple meal of pasta and roasted vegetables, and we sat at her small table in the glow of a single overhead light. Over the meal, she told me she'd been thinking about the idea of living together. She said, you know, if we're serious about figuring out if we can go the distance, maybe we should take that step. My chest flooded with relief and hope. Living together felt like the big, tangible test of our compatibility. Would we fight over laundry or bond over cooking dinners together? We decided to ease into it. She still had a few months left on her lease, so I began sleeping over more often, helping with chores, paying part of the bills. My own studio apartment was month to month, so I kept it for a while but spent most nights at her place. We quickly learned things about each other we never had, how she meticulously folds clothes and organizes them by color, while I tend to toss shirts and jeans into the same drawer. How she needs half an hour of quiet in the morning to properly wake up, while I'm chatty as soon as my eyes open. Our first argument in this new arrangement was over an unwashed frying pan I'd left in the sink overnight. She was upset that I'd said I'd clean it and forgot. I got defensive, claiming it was just one pan. It escalated for a moment, but then we both paused, took a breath, and tried to see it from the other's point of view. That was the first time we'd worked through a conflict in real time, rather than smoothing it over or ignoring it. Eventually, it was time to decide if we'd move into a new place together or keep separate apartments. After many discussions, we found a modest one-bedroom unit in a building closer to downtown. Not fancy, not huge, but big enough for two. The walls were painted an odd shade of pale green, but the view out the living room window was of a row of big maple trees, which we both loved. The day we signed the lease, Emily squeezed my hand and gave me a look that was half excitement, half trepidation. I kissed her forehead and told her I was ready. She said, "So am I." During this period, I also took a hard look at my life goals. I'd been working for my dad's contracting business more or less out of convenience, doing odd jobs, learning some trades, but never fully committing. I didn't see a future in it for myself. The truth was, I'd always loved nature, the smell of pine needles, the crunch of gravel underfoot when hiking, the thrill of seeing wildlife in its habitat. Some of my fondest memories with Emily were of spontaneous weekend trips to national parks. She'd pack a tent and a cooler of snacks, and I'd drive us out to some scenic spot. We'd sit by the fire at night, stargazing and talking about random ideas. One evening, when the stars were especially bright, she said offhandedly, "You'd make a great park ranger." That comment had stuck in my brain. Now, with my mother's health precarious, it felt like if I truly wanted to honor her legacy, I should pursue something that lit a fire in. I started researching the requirements for becoming a park ranger. I realized I'd likely need at least a bachelor's degree in environmental science or a related field. I'd completed 3 years of college before dropping out, so it wasn't a total stretch to return. Emily was immediately supportive, even browsing programs with me online, encouraging me to check out local colleges that offered environmental studies. My father, although he hoped I might take on a bigger role in his business, didn't protest. He wanted me to be happy, in his quiet way. My siblings were thrilled, saying it was about time I found my calling. I remember the day I enrolled in a local university. I came home with the acceptance letter, waving it around excitedly. Emily greeted me at the door of our new place and she squealed in delight. We celebrated with cheap wine and pizza on paper plates, and I was so elated that for once, I didn't worry about anything else. I felt a sense of direction, a forward momentum that had been missing from my life for too long. That night, as Emily and I curled up together, I said, "I can't believe how much has changed in just a few weeks." She nestled against my shoulder and replied, "I think we were both ready for it." Meanwhile, I started opening up more to Emily about my mother. Mom's condition was a roller coaster. Some treatments seemed to stabilize her for a time, then the cancer would come roaring back. I called her every other day and I visited whenever I could. Emily often came with. We'd sit by Mom's bedside or in the living room if she was feeling up to it, just talking. My mother, despite her pain, seemed almost at peace. She told stories of her youth, of how she and Dad had bought the farmhouse when they were newlyweds, how she once dreamed of traveling the world but found a different kind of fulfillment in raising a family close to the land. Sometimes we'd laugh with her, sometimes we'd cry. But I never avoided the subject any. That was the biggest shift. I let Emily see my fear, my sadness, my grief in real time, rather than only showing her my carefree side. She, in turn, told me about her own anxieties. She worried about her career path too. She wanted to help kids, maybe as a counselor, maybe as a teacher, but she didn't know how to start. We talked about her looking into graduate programs or volunteer opportunities. It felt like for the first time, we were genuinely supporting each other's deeper dreams. Around this time, I started reading relationship advice books that people online had recommended. A lot of it felt obvious once I read it, but I realized I'd never actively put this knowledge into practice. How to communicate expectations, how to compromise, how to handle conflict without letting it fester. Some nights, I'd share insights from those books with Emily, and we'd talk about how they applied to us. For instance, one chapter explained how couples often argue about surface-level topics, like a messy kitchen, but rarely dig into the underlying concerns, like feeling taken for granted. Recognizing that pattern helped us talk about our needs more openly. I might say, "Hey, when you remind me 5 times to put the dishes away, I feel like you don't trust me." And she might reply, "I'm sorry, I just feel anxious when things pile up because it reminds me of how my parents used to fight." Suddenly, a petty quarrel became a window into deeper emotional truths. In the middle of all these changes, that ring stayed tucked in a drawer. I'd sometimes take it out late at night, running my thumb over the polished surface, thinking about my original impulsive proposal. My mother's words echoed, "You'll know what to do with this," and I realized she hadn't necessarily meant propose right away. Maybe she meant I'd figure out when the time was truly right, how to protect that heirloom until then. I felt no rush now. The pressing urge I'd felt before had subsided, replaced by a patient hope that Emily and I would naturally arrive at a place where marriage was the next logical step. Living with Emily was both a joy and a challenge. Every day brought new small revelations about who we were as individuals. We discovered that we both hated grocery shopping after 5 p.m. because the store was chaotic, so we started going early on Saturdays, making a little date out of it. We realized we had different approaches to cooking. She liked to follow recipes meticulously, while I preferred to freestyle. We laughed over each other's missteps. I once used salt instead of sugar in a batch of cookies, but also sometimes clashed. She once snapped at me for cutting vegetables in what she deemed the wrong shape, and I got defensive. However, these minor disagreements gradually taught us how to negotiate, how to see the humor in our differences, and most importantly, how to talk about any tension before it escalated. Financially, we were learning to be transparent as well. I had some savings, mostly from working with my dad, but I was about to become a student again, which meant I'd need loans or scholarships. Emily worked part-time as a teaching assistant at a local preschool while also finishing her own coursework, so we weren't exactly flush with cash. We sat down one evening with our combined bills, rent, groceries, utilities, phone plans, gas, and mapped out a budget. It was eye-opening for both of us. We realized how quickly small expenses added up, how important it was to plan for emergency. For me, it was the first time I truly felt like an adult, forging a life with someone else rather than just living day to day. One rainy afternoon, about 2 months after my botched proposal, Emily and I took a break from unpacking boxes to talk about the future. She asked how I'd feel if down the line she wanted to relocate for a job opportunity or for grad school. The conversation turned to the possibility that I might need to move to a rural area if I got a park ranger position in a national park. Instead of panicking, we calmly discussed how we'd handle it, the financial and emotional implications, how we'd stay connected. By the end, we concluded that we could make it work if we kept an open line of communication. That moment felt symbolic. We were no longer just a carefree couple coasting along. We were actively planning for the uncertainties of life, brainstorming ways to support each other, even if circumstances changed. My mother's condition stabilized somewhat for a time, and she was able to come over to our new place for dinner. We cleaned and prepared a simple meal. She sank into our old thrift store couch with a soft laugh, commenting on how cozy it felt. She pulled me aside at one point and said, "I see the way you two look at each other now. It's different from before." I asked what she meant, and she smiled. "It's like you've seen each other's vulnerabilities and decided to love each other anyway." That's real. Those words echoed in my head for weeks after. Had we ever truly seen each other before, beyond the fun? Now, it felt like we were seeing each other in a more complete light. Not everything was perfect. We still had lighthearted days and occasional squabbles, but there was a depth to it. A sense that we were building a foundation brick by brick. I was pouring the same energy into my studies, determined to do well so I could eventually become a park ranger. My classes in environmental science ignited a curiosity in me I'd forgotten I had. I found myself reading scientific articles, volunteering for cleanup days at local parks, and engaging my professors with a passion I never showed in my earlier college years. Emily would jokingly call me Mr. Ranger around the apartment, and sometimes I'd laugh, imagining the day I'd actually wear that uniform and greet visitors at a trailhead. It didn't feel like a childish dream anymore. It felt attainable. Through all of this, Emily never once said, "When are you going to propose again?" or anything like that. She seemed content to let our relationship evolve naturally. We'd occasionally talk about marriage in abstract terms, wondering if we'd have a small wedding or a big gathering, if we'd want a band or a DJ, or if we might even prefer something as simple as standing under our favorite oak tree exchanging vows. But we spoke of it as a someday scenario, not a pressing matter. And the more time passed, the more I appreciated this gradual approach. It didn't feel forced or overshadowed by my mother's condition. It felt authentic. On the flip side, I faced moments of doubt. Late at night, lying awake, I'd wonder if Emily was truly sure. What if she never felt that marriage was right for us? What if she discovered her own ambitions that led her away from it? But each day, through our actions, we were choosing to stay, to support, to love. That was more reassuring than any vow or ring could be at this stage. And so I reminded myself that reassurance comes from consistent care and honesty, not from a single grand gesture. As the semester wore on, I found myself busier than ever, working part-time for my dad, attending classes, studying, and nurturing a relationship with Emily. Yet I felt more alive, more present. My father noticed the difference too. One evening, After we'd spent a day at a job site repairing someone's roof, he told me, "I'm proud of you, son. I never said it before, but I always worried you weren't aiming at anything. Seems like you found your way." It meant a lot to hear those words, especially from a man who rarely expressed emotion. Maybe he recognized that I wasn't drifting anymore. One weekend, Emily and I drove out to a nearby state park. The leaves had mostly fallen, leaving the branches stark against a cloudy sky. We hiked along a trail that overlooked a winding river, our footsteps crunching leaves on the path. A chilly wind tugged at our jackets, and I could see the faint swirl of my breath as we climbed higher. When we reached a scenic overlook, Emily paused, gazing at the broad expanse of water below. She turned to me and asked, "Do you ever think about that day you proposed?" She wasn't accusing or angry. She seemed curious, reflective. I nodded. "All the time," I admitted. "I'm glad we're where we are now, though. I think that day was a wake-up call that there was so much we hadn't yet built." She took my hand, squeezed it gently, and nodded. I leaned in and kissed her forehead, the cold air stinging my cheeks. In that moment, I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. Though my mother's condition improved slightly in the fall, winter brought new challenges. She underwent more treatments, and there were days she was too exhausted to speak for long. I'd sit by her bedside, sometimes quietly holding her hand. She would muster the energy to ask about my classes, about Emily, about our life together. I'd smile and update her, carefully omitting any stress or negative details because I wanted to keep her spirits high. But eventually I realized that was the old me, the one who kept burdens to himself. So one snowy afternoon, I told her about a recent argument Emily and I had. It was over something small, but it escalated. My mother listened quietly, then said, "Every couple who's lasted has stories like that. It's not the absence of arguments that matters. It's how you come back together after." She looked at me with tired eyes and added, "Don't hide your difficulties from me. Share them. That's what families do." I leaned over and kissed her forehead, tears threatening to spill. As I left her room, I realized that this new openness had extended to my relationship with my mother as well. The next few months were a whirlwind of studying, living with Emily, and navigating the complexities of my mom's illness. We celebrated small milestones: our first shared Thanksgiving, cooking in a cramped kitchen, taking turns stirring pots and nearly burning the rolls. We exchanged gifts in December, picking out small, meaningful items for each other rather than anything extravagant. She gave me a new hiking backpack, embroidered with a tiny pine tree to carry my books. I gave her a special journal with a personal inscription on the inside cover, encouraging her to write down her dreams and plans for working with children. Through all these moments, I felt a steady undercurrent of closeness that didn't exist before. It was as though my impulsive proposal, though it hadn't led to engagement, had ignited a deeper process of growth. I started volunteering at a local nature reserve on weekends, helping with guided tours and educational programs. Emily would sometimes join, listening in as I explained local flora and fauna to visitors. I noticed how she'd smile proudly whenever a curious child asked me a question about the environment, and I answered confidently. It was in those moments that I saw a glimmer of our possible future. Me as a park ranger, her working with kids, maybe we'd combine our passions somehow. It wasn't a pipe dream, it was something we were actively moving toward. Even in the midst of progress, there were setbacks. Emily and I had a few more significant fights. Once, she accused me of not doing my fair share of household tasks when I got swamped with assignments. Another time, I felt she was shutting me out emotionally after a hard day at her preschool job. Each time, though, we eventually sat down and talked. It wasn't always pretty. Sometimes we'd go to bed angry, but the next morning we'd try again. It was an ongoing lesson in communication, empathy, and forgiveness. And with each conflict resolved, we gained a bit more faith in our collective resilience. All the while, that ring remained in my drawer, a silent witness to how much we'd grown. Every so often, I'd open the drawer to grab a pair of socks and see the velvet box tucked away. I'd touch it gently, remembering the day I first held it in my hand. Sometimes I'd smile at how naive I was. Other times, I'd feel a pang of longing to slip it onto Emily's finger. But I never acted on that impulse. I wanted to wait until it felt undeniably right for both of us. The turning point for me came late one winter night. Emily and I were sitting at our small kitchen table, paying bills and looking over next month's budget. We'd had a tense week, with her schedule at the preschool ramping up and my finals looming. I noticed how tired she looked, how the circles under her eyes seemed a bit darker. I asked if she was okay, and she admitted she felt overwhelmed, that sometimes she worried we were just existing from day to day, not truly planning or thriving. She confessed a lingering fear that maybe we'd end up stuck if we kept waiting for the perfect time to take big leaps. "I still want to marry you someday," she said quietly, "but I want us to be sure." My heart soared at that admission, that after all these months of living and learning together, she still envisioned a future with. I told her I felt the same, that I too wanted marriage at some point. I apologized for my initial push, explained that I was still learning to separate my love for her from the fear of losing my mom. We talked about the possibility of a future engagement. She admitted that while she wasn't ready at that very moment, she could see herself saying yes in the not-too-distant future if we continued to grow. It wasn't a promise carved in stone, but it felt genuine. It felt real. As winter turned to spring, my mother's health took a downward turn. She became weaker, more fragile. I worried constantly, though I tried to focus on my classes and final exams. Emily was a pillar of support, offering to drive me to my parents' house, cooking meals so I didn't have to, giving me space when I needed it. She didn't demand I be cheerful or present all the time. She understood I was grieving in slow motion, watching someone I loved slip away bit by bit. On a particularly difficult day when Mom was hospitalized, Emily came to the hospital after work, holding my hand in the waiting room. My father, stoic as ever, thanked her for coming. I think in that moment he recognized she was truly family. When the doctors finally let us see Mom, we went in together. She managed a weak smile, asked how school was going, teased me about whether I'd gotten any better at folding a fitted sheet. Even in her pain, she found humor. She then looked at Emily and said, "Thank you for taking such good care of him." Emily's eyes filled with tears. She simply nodded, and they shared a quiet moment of understanding. Shortly after that, Mom was able to return home with a hospice care arrangement. It was a bittersweet relief that she'd be comfortable, surrounded by her own things. I spent as many afternoons with her as I could, sometimes just holding her hand while she rested. One weekend, Emily joined me, and as we were leaving, Mom called me back into her bedroom. She gestured for me to come closer. Her voice was faint, but she whispered, "Don't lose sight of your dreams." Then, taking a breath, she added, "And when the time is right, give her that ring. Don't wait for me. Do it for you." Tears stung my eyes. I promised her I would find the right moment, whenever that might be. That conversation stayed with me. It reminded me that this ring wasn't about fulfilling someone else's timeline or trying to create happiness in the face of sorrow. It was about a love that should naturally reach the point of lifelong commitment. I knew then that I was content to let that moment reveal itself, without forcing it. So that's how Emily and I have carried on, continuing to learn, to plan, to dream. We've grown even closer in the face of my mother's battle with cancer, forging a deeper emotional bond than we ever had before. My schooling is going well, and I'm on track to graduate with a degree that should allow me to become a park ranger. Emily's considering applying to graduate schools to specialize in counseling, though she's also interested in direct classroom. We talk about living near a national park one day, about how she might work in a local school system or a community center, and how I'll come home from the ranger station, eager to share stories of the day's adventures among the trees and wildlife. She smiles at that image, and so do I. We still have normal life stresses: money, chores, car troubles, occasional misunderstanding, but each challenge is an opportunity to reaffirm our ability to communicate, to comfort each other, to compromise. And that, I've realized, is real love. It's not about the absence of pain or the guarantee of bliss. It's about mutual dedication to working through life's complexities together. In the moments when I look at Emily laughing with my sister, or helping my dad figure out a new phone, or simply humming to herself in the kitchen while she waits for the water to boil, I feel an overwhelming fondness and admiration for her. She's no longer just the fun, easygoing girlfriend I used to date. She's the woman who's walked with me through fear, doubt, and grief, and who's allowed me into her own worries and hopes. We've forged a partnership based on more than butterflies and late-night giggles. It's built on shared burdens and honest conversation. Yes, there are nights I still feel a pang when I see that ring in my drawer. Part of me wants to slip it onto Emily's finger and make a grand declaration, but another part of me is at peace with waiting. After all, an engagement should be a milestone in a story we're crafting every day, not a patch for unhealed wounds or an escape from present troubles. I want to propose in a way that reflects the real us, the couple we've grown into. Maybe that will be next spring or summer, maybe later. I only know that when it happens, it will be a moment of deep resonance, the culmination of the work we've put into us, not a reaction to fear or urgency. I've watched Emily grow too. She's more open about her frustrations, less likely to bottle up her feelings. She has begun looking into volunteer opportunities with children's advocacy programs in our area. I've seen her reading books on childhood development, and she'll enthusiastically share statistics or stories she's found. In those moments, I see her passion shining, the same way I feel my own ignite when I'm outside, noticing a rare bird or identifying a particular tree species. I think about how I used to be so lackadaisical, just drifting, and how she never pushed me to change, yet inspired me simply by being who she is. That's love too, helping each other discover our best selves.